At the engagement dinner, my future daughter-in-law stared at me and said, "If you really care about your son's happiness, you'll walk away from this family forever." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the chandelier above us and the soft clink of silverware against china. 14 pairs of eyes turned toward me. My son Daniel looked down at his plate. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look surprised. The woman sitting across from me, Olivia, the woman he planned to marry in 6 weeks, held my gaze with the calm confidence of someone who believed she had already won. Around us, the private dining room glowed with candlelight. Crystal glasses reflected warm gold across the table. The engagement cake waited untouched in the corner beside bouquets of white roses. It should have been a celebration. Instead, it felt like an eviction notice. "I think that's enough, Olivia," my sister whispered. "No," Olivia replied without taking her eyes off me. "Daniel deserves a fresh start without old obligations pulling him backward." Old obligations. That was what 27 years of raising my son alone had become. Not sacrifices. Not memories. Obligations. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass, but my voice remained steady. I placed the glass gently on the table, unlocked my phone beneath the linen napkin, and sent a single message. Then I waited. 20 minutes later, the room would never feel the same again. My name is Margaret Hale, and for most of my life, I was the person who solved problems quietly, enough that nobody noticed they existed. In the first place, my husband died when Daniel was 8 years old. One ordinary Tuesday morning, he left for work and never came home. By Friday, I was a widow with a frightened little boy sitting at my kitchen table asking whether his father would still see his school play. I learned very quickly that grief does not pause the electric bill, mortgage payments, or childhood fevers. So I worked. I taught history at the local college during the day, tutored students in the evenings, and spent weekends grading papers while Daniel slept on the sofa beside my desk. There were years when I owned one winter coat and repaired the same pair of shoes 3 times. Daniel never knew. As far as he was concerned, birthdays arrived on time, Christmas gifts appeared under the tree, and college tuition somehow paid itself. That was exactly how I wanted it. People praise sacrifice when they can see it. The invisible kind simply becomes expectation. By the time Daniel became a successful corporate attorney at 35, my role in his life had quietly shifted. I was no longer the woman who built the foundation. I was the furniture sitting on it. Useful, familiar, easy to ignore. Olivia understood that dynamic almost immediately. She was intelligent, polished, and exceptionally skilled at making disrespect sound reasonable. She never raised her voice. She simply introduced me as Daniel's mother instead of Margaret, excluded me from decisions that affected the family, and spoke about my retirement as if it were a long and inconvenient epilogue. Everyone was waiting to finish. The remarkable thing about being underestimated for long enough is that people stop imagining you have limits or options. Eventually, they stop noticing what you still control. The engagement dinner wasn't the beginning. It was simply the first time Olivia said the quiet part out loud. Before that, the insults arrived dressed as kindness. When Daniel bought their new house, I learned about it from photographs on social media, 3 days after the papers had been signed. "We didn't want to burden you with the details," Olivia had explained over coffee, stirring her cup without looking up, as though my involvement would have been a burden rather than an interest. At family gatherings, seating arrangements changed in subtle ways. I was no longer beside my son. I found myself at the far end of tables, between distant cousins and neighbors, while Olivia occupied the seat beside him effortlessly, naturally, permanently. Once, during wedding planning, I suggested using the silver candle holders that had belonged to Daniel's grandmother. Olivia smiled politely. "Oh, we're trying to avoid making the evening feel dated." The conversation moved on before I could answer. Daniel said nothing. That silence became its own language. There were pauses when he could have spoken. Glances in my direction that lasted half a second too long before drifting away. Small moments, where loyalty and convenience stood side by side and convenience won. One rainy Sunday afternoon, I arrived at their house carrying a box of Daniel's childhood photographs. Olivia had asked to borrow for the reception slideshow. She opened the door only halfway. "We already hired someone to handle the family history section," she said gently. The box remained in my hands. Behind her, I could see framed engagement portraits lining the hallway. There wasn't a single photograph older than 2 years. Standing on that doorstep with rain gathering at my collar, I realized something important. Olivia wasn't trying to become part of our family. She was carefully editing it. And Daniel, whether through weakness or agreement, had handed her the pen. There is a peculiar kind of clarity that arrives when someone finally says aloud what everyone else has been politely pretending not to mean. If you really care about your son's happiness, you'll walk away from this family forever. Olivia's words did not shock me because they were cruel. They shocked me because they were honest. Not honest about me. Honest about them. I looked around the table. Daniel still hadn't spoken. His fingers rested against the stem of his wine glass as though he were waiting for the moment to pass on its own. My sister stared at him in disbelief. His uncle shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Someone near the window coughed into the silence. But the only opinion that mattered sat 3 seats to my left, with his eyes fixed firmly on the tablecloth. For years, I had mistaken silence for conflict avoidance. That evening, I finally understood that silence could also be agreement. The realization hurt less than I expected. Perhaps because grief recognizes familiar rooms. I had already survived losing my husband. Somewhere along the years, I had quietly survived losing my son, too. I simply hadn't admitted it yet. The strange thing was that once the truth settled in, anger never arrived. Only certainty. I thought about the trust Daniel's father and I had established years earlier. I thought about signatures placed on documents nobody had discussed in over a decade. I thought about promises made between 2 parents who believed family meant permanence. For the first time that evening, I smiled. Not out of bitterness. Not out of victory. Simply understanding. If they wanted a future untouched by my presence, then they were entitled to discover what my absence actually looked like. I placed my glass carefully onto the white tablecloth, unlocked my phone beneath the table, and sent a single message. Please proceed as discussed. Then I returned the phone to my lap and waited for the consequences to arrive. Revenge is noisy when it is driven by anger. Consequences are quiet. The message I sent that evening had not created a plan. It had simply activated one. 10 years earlier, after Daniel graduated from law school, his father's business partner had invited me to lunch. Harold Bennett had been my husband's closest friend for nearly 20 years and the executor of his estate after the accident. During that meeting, he had asked me a question that seemed strange at the time. What happens if one day your son mistakes inheritance for entitlement? I remember laughing. Daniel was kind then. Grateful. Young enough to believe love and loyalty arrived naturally and stayed forever. Still, Harold insisted on preparing protections that would only matter if they were ever needed. The family trust remained under independent management. The lake house where Daniel planned to spend his honeymoon weekend, technically, belonged to the trust. So did the downtown office building that provided most of the family's investment income. Access to both depended on one condition, written into the original structure years earlier. The surviving founder retained lifetime authority over discretionary distributions and usage rights. I had never exercised that authority. There had never been a reason to. Harold had retired 2 years earlier, but his successor, Rebecca Lynn, remained the acting trustee and had standing instructions to contact me before approving any exceptional requests involving family assets. The message I sent contained only 4 words. Please proceed as discussed. Nothing more. No explanations. No emotion. 3 months earlier, after noticing the increasingly deliberate efforts to remove me from decisions involving family property and finances, I had quietly requested a full review of every arrangement carrying my signature or consent. Not because I intended retaliation, because responsibility requires attention. The review had already been completed. All that remained was deciding whether I wished to continue saying yes. That evening, for the first time in many years, my answer was no. The first vibration came from Olivia's phone. She glanced at the screen and frowned. Then came Daniel's. A few seconds later, Harold's successor, Rebecca Lynn, appeared in his caller ID. For the first time that evening, my son looked directly at me. "Excuse me for a moment," he said, standing from the table. Olivia followed him into the hallway outside the private dining room. Through the glass doors, I watched the conversation unfold in silence. Daniel reading, stopping, reading again. Olivia reaching for the phone, her expression changing almost imperceptibly. Confusion first, then disbelief, then calculation. When they returned, neither of them sat down immediately. Daniel remained standing beside his chair. "Mom," he began carefully, "Rebecca says the trustee has suspended authorization for the lake house. Transfer until ownership. Arrangements are reviewed?" I nodded once. The review is standard procedure when long-term family participation changes. The word sounded almost clinical. Because they were. Olivia's voice remained controlled, but only just. The honeymoon booking was made around that property. I know. The reception venue deposit came from the trust distribution. I know that too. Around us, the room had become unnaturally still. No one touched their food. No one reached for their glasses. The soft music from the restaurant suddenly felt very far away. Daniel stared at me as if seeing a stranger, or perhaps as if seeing me clearly for the first time. "You planned this?" I met his eyes. "No, Daniel." My voice remained calm. "You planned a future that required me to disappear while continuing to benefit from everything I spent decades protecting. The distinction mattered. I had taken nothing from them. I had simply stopped offering what they had already decided I no longer deserved to be part of." Across the table, Olivia lowered her eyes for the first time that evening. 20 minutes earlier, she had asked me to walk away from the family forever. Now, for the first time, she was beginning to understand what that request actually cost. No one argued with me. That was perhaps the strangest part. There was no dramatic accusation, no overturned chairs, no public scene worthy of the expensive restaurant surrounding us. Reality rarely announces itself that way. It simply arrives and refuses to leave. Daniel sat down slowly, but he no longer touched his food. Olivia remained perfectly still beside him, her hands folded together so tightly that the color had disappeared from her knuckles. Around the table, relatives exchanged the kind of glances families use when everyone suddenly realizes they have witnessed something much larger than the conversation itself. My sister was the first to speak. "Margaret built those assets with your father," she said quietly to Daniel. "People forget history when history is standing in front of them." No one disagreed, because everyone in that room knew the truth. They remembered the years after the accident, the extra jobs, the late nights, the birthdays I never missed despite exhaustion, the school events where I arrived directly from work still carrying papers to grade. Sacrifice has a way of becoming invisible once it succeeds. People begin admiring the finished building and forget the person who spent years laying the foundation beneath it. Daniel looked older than he had an hour earlier. Not because of the trust. Not because of the property. Because for the first time, he was being forced to measure value separately from convenience. The room had stopped asking whether I belonged in the family. The question had quietly become whether the family deserved access to what I had spent my life protecting. And that question reaches far beyond inheritance. Every family, every friendship, every relationship eventually arrives at the same crossroads. Do we appreciate people while they are present? Or only notice their worth when they finally stop giving? By the end of the evening, the engagement dinner was no longer about money, property, or authority. It was about recognition. And recognition, once withheld for long enough, eventually becomes expensive. The wedding went ahead 4 months later, smaller than originally planned. Different venue, different honeymoon, different expectations. I was invited. I attended. Not because anyone demanded forgiveness or delivered dramatic apologies beneath pouring rain and orchestral music. Life rarely offers endings that tidy. Instead, Daniel came to my house one afternoon, carrying 2 coffees and 20 years of assumptions he was finally prepared to examine. For the first 10 minutes, we spoke about weather, traffic, and work. Then he placed his cup down and said quietly, "I think I confused your strength with permanence." I understood what he meant. When someone has always been there, always solved problems, always absorbed disappointment without complaint, it becomes dangerously easy to believe they will continue doing so forever. People mistake reliability for obligation, presence for ownership, love for permission. Olivia never apologized for wanting a life centered around her new family. In truth, there was nothing wrong with that. What mattered was the belief that building something new required erasing what came before. Over time, she and I learned something neither of us had understood at the engagement dinner. Families are not museums, but they are not demolition sites either. Some foundations deserve respect simply because everything else stands on them. As for the trust, some privileges eventually returned. Others did not. Not as punishment, as balance. For the first time in decades, I began making decisions based not on what everyone else needed from me, but on what I wanted for myself. I traveled. I returned to teaching part-time. I planted the garden my husband and I had always talked about building. And slowly, almost surprisingly, my life became larger after I stopped shrinking it for others. Sometimes people ask whether I regret sending that message. I don't, because the most powerful revenge was never taking something away. It was allowing people to experience the full weight of what they had asked to lose. And there is a lesson many people learn far too late. The people who hold a family together rarely announce that they are doing it. You only notice their hands when they finally let go.